The village of Little Wickham had always prided itself on maintaining proper English traditions, which was precisely why Mrs. Vivian Ashworth's return after 30 years abroad had caused such a delightful stir among the residents. The midnight tea-house, housed in the converted Victorian mansion known as Rosemere, offered something that challenged every sensible notion of when tea ought to be served, yet did so with such elegant propriety that even the most traditional villagers found themselves curious. On this particular October evening, as autumn mist clung to the diamond-paned windows and gas lamps flickered along the village lanes, 15 carefully selected guests had gathered for what Mrs. Ashworth had mysteriously termed her harvest moon ceremony. The great drawing-room of Rosemere had been transformed into something between an elegant tea salon and a theatrical stage, with Persian rugs scattered across polished oak floors, heavy velvet curtains blocking the night, and dozens of beeswax candles casting dancing shadows across antique furniture that spoke of old money and older secrets. Miss Jane Marple, settling into a comfortable wing-back chair near the fireplace with her knitting, observed the assembled company with the gentle attention that had served her so well over the years. Her nephew Raymond's wife had pressed the invitation upon her with such enthusiasm that refusal would have seemed churlish, though Miss Marple suspected there were deeper currents at work than mere social courtesy. Mrs. Ashworth herself was a striking figure in her early 60s, silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and wearing a flowing dress of deep emerald silk that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. She moved through her guests with practiced grace, ensuring that the delicate china teacups remained filled with her specially blended Ceylon tea, and that conversation flowed as smoothly as the exotic brews she served. Yet Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension in their hostess's manner, a tightness around her dark eyes that suggested the evening held more significance than mere social entertainment. The guest list itself was intriguing. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, the village physician, sat rather stiffly in his chair, his usual genial bedside manner replaced by an air of barely concealed agitation. His wife, Eleanor, a thin woman with nervous hands that constantly worried at her pearl necklace, kept glancing toward the door as if contemplating escape. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the local solicitor, had positioned himself strategically near the fireplace, his sharp features made even more angular by the flickering flames, while his wife Constance maintained the sort of bright smile that spoke of long practice in concealing unpleasant thoughts. More intriguing still were the guests Miss Marple didn't immediately recognize. A young woman with striking auburn hair and an expensive coat sat somewhat apart from the others, her green eyes constantly scanning the room with what appeared to be professional interest. She had been introduced as Miss Diana Forrester, recently returned from London, though her connection to Little Wickham remained mysteriously unspecified. An elderly gentleman with a military bearing, Colonel Weatherby, kept checking his pocket watch with the precision of a man accustomed to punctuality, while a middle-aged couple, the Blackwoods, whispered urgently to each other in the corner, their conversation too low to overhear, but their body language suggesting profound disagreement. As the evening progressed and the tea grew stronger, Mrs. Ashworth began to weave stories of her years in Ceylon, tales of plantation life and colonial society that held her audience captive. But it was when she began speaking of memory, of things buried and forgotten, of truths that time could not diminish, that the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. "You see," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality as she refilled the ornate silver teapot with her special midnight blend. "Distance and time have a way of clarifying things wonderfully. What seems desperately important when you're living it day by day often fades to nothing, while the things you thought insignificant reveal their true weight. I've spent 30 years thinking about Little Wickham, about the people I left behind, about the small dramas that played out in drawing rooms very much like this one." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Miss Marple noticed how several guests had gone very still, their teacups suspended halfway to their lips, their eyes fixed on their hostess with expressions ranging from polite curiosity to what appeared to be genuine alarm. Dr. Pemberton's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his cup, while Mrs. Hartwell's bright smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed determination. It was then that Mrs. Ashworth smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and announced that she had invited them all here tonight for a very specific purpose. She had, she said, some rather illuminating information to share about certain events that had taken place in Little Wickham 3 decades ago. Events that some people had worked very hard indeed to forget. The grandfather clock in the corner had just begun its measured chiming of midnight when Mrs. Ashworth excused herself to fetch a special bottle of brandy from the library. "For those who prefer something stronger than tea at this late hour," she said with that same enigmatic smile, "I have a rather exceptional cognac that I've been saving for precisely the right moment." She had been gone perhaps 5 minutes when the scream pierced the genteel atmosphere of the drawing-room. It came from the direction of the library, sharp and brief, followed by a sound that made every person in the room freeze, the unmistakable crash of something heavy falling to the floor. Dr. Pemberton was the first to move, his medical training overriding whatever personal discomfort he might have felt, but even as he hurried toward the library door with several others close behind, Miss Marple could see from his expression that they were already too late. They found Mrs. Vivian Ashworth collapsed beside her mahogany desk, the promised bottle of cognac shattered on the Persian rug beside her, its amber contents mixing with something far darker that was spreading slowly across the intricate pattern. Her emerald dress was arranged with an almost theatrical precision, as if she had been carefully posed, and her face bore an expression of profound surprise rather than pain. Dr. Pemberton knelt beside her still form, checking for vital signs with practiced efficiency, but the grim set of his features told the story before he spoke the words aloud. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, who had returned to Little Wickham with such mysterious purpose and such dangerous knowledge, was dead. As the shocked guests stood frozen in the doorway, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the scene with quiet thoroughness. The library window stood slightly ajar, though the latch appeared secure. A small silver letter opener lay on the desk, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. Most curious of all, the leather-bound appointment book that lay open beside the inkwell showed today's date, with a single entry written in Mrs. Ashworth's elegant hand. The truth will out. Midnight. The midnight tea-house, which had promised such exotic pleasures, had delivered instead the most traditional of English mysteries, a locked-room murder in a country house with a carefully selected group of suspects, each harboring secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting and prepared to listen very carefully indeed to everything that would be said in the next few hours. In her long experience, the most revealing truths were often spoken in the immediate aftermath of shock, when people's carefully constructed facades crumbled just enough to let reality show through. The immediate aftermath of Mrs. Ashworth's discovery brought a controlled chaos that would have been almost theatrical had the circumstances been less grim. Dr. Pemberton, having confirmed what everyone already suspected, stood slowly from beside the still form, his medical authority carrying unusual weight in the candlelit library. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, summoned by the doctor's urgent telephone call to the police station in Ashford. Miss Marple recognized the inspector from previous unfortunate incidents in the district and found his presence oddly reassuring as he took command with practiced efficiency. The library was sealed, the remaining guests confined to the drawing room under police supervision, and the methodical process of preliminary questioning began. Yet even under official scrutiny, Miss Marple observed how each person processed to the shocking turn of events, their carefully maintained social facades beginning to show hairline cracks that revealed the truth beneath. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton had collapsed into the nearest chair, her thin frame trembling with what appeared to be genuine distress. "I simply can't believe she's gone," she whispered repeatedly, her nervous hands clutching a lace handkerchief. after all these years away, to come back only to... It seems impossible. Her husband stood protectively beside her, though Miss Marple noticed his attention kept drifting toward the sealed library door with an expression that suggested professional curiosity warring with personal unease. The Hartwells maintained their social composure with practiced ease, though Mrs. Constance Hartwell's perpetual smile had taken on a brittle quality that made it more unsettling than reassuring. "Such a tragedy on what was meant to be such a lovely evening," she murmured to anyone within earshot. Poor Vivian must have had some sort of attack. She always was rather highly strung, even as a girl. Her husband, Geoffrey, nodded gravely, his legal training evident in his carefully measured responses to Inspector Craddock's questions, emphasizing how perfectly well Mrs. Ashworth had seemed when she left to fetch the brandy. Miss Diana Forrester, the mysterious young woman from London, had withdrawn to a corner chair where she sat with remarkable composure, her green eyes moving constantly between the other guests as if cataloguing their reactions. Colonel Weatherby maintained his military bearing despite the circumstances, checking his pocket watch with the same regularity he had displayed earlier, while the Blackwoods sat in uncharacteristic silence, their earlier whispered disagreements apparently forgotten in the face of more pressing concerns. By morning, despite the late hour of the crime and Inspector Craddock's attempts at discretion, the news had spread through Little Wickham with the inexorable efficiency of village gossip. At the post office, Mrs. Tibbet held court with theatrical authority, declaring to anyone who would listen that it was poison in her own tea, a fitting end for a woman who kept such late hours and spoke of skeletons in cupboards. The theories multiplied as they spread. At Green's grocer's, Mr. Green insisted it had been the letter opener, cleaner than a knife, if you take my meaning. While in the snug of the Crown and Heart, speculation centered on financial motives and old grudges. Each theory seemed to reveal more about the speaker's own anxieties than about the actual crime. Back at Rosemere, as the guests were permitted limited conversation under police supervision, their own theories began to emerge with telling precision. Mrs. Hartwell whispered urgently about that old scandal, and how Vivian had been practically inviting someone to silence her. Dr. Pemberton offered a clinical assessment that the deceased had been clearly unstable, bringing up ancient history, while carefully avoiding mention of his own visible agitation the previous evening. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell adopted a posture of weary resignation, suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth was a woman with a past who had pushed someone too far with her promised revelations. Miss Diana Forrester observed with detached precision that their hostess had been a storyteller who perhaps wrote someone into her narrative who didn't appreciate the role. Even the usually reticent Blackwoods emerged from their shell to suggest the murder was a judgment connected to that dreadful business with the orphanage funds all those years ago, such a scandal hushed up by certain prominent families. Miss Marple continued her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she absorbed every word and gesture. Each theory, each whispered accusation, revealed less about the actual murderer and more about the speaker's own connections to whatever secrets Mrs. Ashworth had threatened to expose. The village was reacting not merely to a murder, but to the violent resurrection of its own carefully buried past. Inspector Craddock returned at first light, bringing with him the methodical efficiency that had served him well in previous cases involving Miss Marple's quiet assistance. He found her in the morning room with her knitting, the Times folded beside her untouched, and her gentle inquiry about whether the night had yielded anything useful reminded him that her questions were never merely polite conversation. Together, they revisited the library, where the mingled scents of cognac and candle wax still lingered in the cool morning air. Miss Marple's keen eyes took in details that spoke to her of careful staging rather than spontaneous violence. A thread of green silk caught in the corner of a drawer, so fine it might have been overlooked entirely. A whisper of ash on the windowsill, scented rather than from pipe tobacco, suggesting someone had been smoking near the slightly opened window. The appointment book remained open to its ominous entry, but Miss Marple noticed a faint smudge of blue ink on the blotter's edge, as if someone had leaned heavily while writing. The questioning of the household staff proved illuminating in ways that formal police interviews often missed. Mrs. Blythe, the housekeeper, revealed that Mrs. Ashworth had made a telephone call from the library at 10:30 before the guests arrived. The conversation had been brief and apparently unsatisfactory, ending with what Mrs. Blythe described as a short laugh that didn't sound amused at all. The housekeeper's certainty about the timing and her obvious discomfort when discussing it suggested the call had been significant enough to disturb the evening's careful preparations. During the formal questioning of guests, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the official proceedings and the unguarded moments between interviews. Dr. Pemberton's medical authority seemed oddly diminished this morning, his usual confidence replaced by defensive explanations about taking notes during the evening. His hands, she noticed, bore faint stains that could have been ink, and his wife's grief appeared layered with something that looked remarkably like relief. When Mrs. Pemberton claimed they had never been particularly close to the deceased, her answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. The Hartwells presented a united front of shocked respectability that aroused Miss Marple's suspicions precisely because of its perfection. Their synchronized account of the evening's events matched with an accuracy that suggested either remarkable shared observation or careful prior coordination. Mrs. Constance Hartwell's perpetual smile never wavered, even when discussing the tragic circumstances, while her husband's legal precision seemed designed more to conceal than to reveal. Miss Diana Forrester proved most intriguing under scrutiny. Her composure was professional rather than shocked, and her claim of knowing Mrs. Ashworth only slightly through mutual London acquaintances rang false when measured against her intimate knowledge of Little Wickham's social dynamics. When pressed about her connection to the deceased, her pause was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught the brief flicker of calculation before the smooth response. Colonel Weatherby's military bearing remained intact, yet his habitual pocket-watch checking had become compulsive, almost frantic. The Blackwoods, when questioned separately, provided the evening's most revealing moment when Mrs. Blackwood broke down entirely, sobbing about old sins and innocent children. Her husband's desperate attempts to silence her only made matters worse, particularly when he blurted out something about the orphanage money before catching himself. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple began to perceive that this was not a crime of sudden passion, but the culmination of a 30-year game played out with deadly patience. Each guest's reaction suggested intimate familiarity with whatever scandal Mrs. Ashworth had threatened to expose, yet their maintained silence indicated a conspiracy of concealment that had endured for decades. Most significantly, none of the guests seemed genuinely surprised by the murder itself, only by its timing and method. Their shock appeared to be the reaction of people who had long feared such a moment might come, rather than the bewilderment of innocents confronted with unexpected violence. The appointment book entry, "The truth will out. Midnight," was not merely a note, but a declaration of war against carefully guarded secrets. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting and reflected that in villages like Little Wickham, the deadliest weapon was often not poison or blade, but truth itself. Someone among these carefully chosen guests possessed a secret worth killing to protect, and 30 years of buried guilt had finally erupted into violence. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had assembled what appeared to be a compelling case against the most obvious suspect. The preliminary medical examination suggested poison. Specifically, the county pathologist noted in guarded terms something that left a faint almond scent beneath the cognac's heavier aroma. Cyanide presented itself as the likely culprit, and in a village practice, few people possessed both the knowledge and access required for such a precise killing. Dr. Marcus Pemberton found himself under increasingly intense scrutiny as the evidence mounted with uncomfortable efficiency. He had, as Mr. Thorne the chemist confirmed with obvious importance, collected a small quantity of prussic acid just 2 days earlier, a routine quarterly acquisition for legitimate medical purposes, he insisted, kept under double lock and never brought near domestic situations. Yet Mrs. Blythe revealed that the doctor had called at Rosemere shortly before the evening began, ostensibly to inquire about Mrs. Ashworth's health, but remaining in the morning room for several minutes unobserved. The motive, when it emerged through careful questioning and loosened village tongues, painted a picture of professional ruin narrowly averted 3 decades earlier. Mrs. Tibbet at the post office, her discretion abandoned in the face of such drama, revealed whispered concerns about Dr. Pemberton's treatment of certain patients at the village orphanage. Nothing proven, she insisted, but there had been questions about medication irregularities and unexplained deaths among the more vulnerable children. Mrs. Ashworth's position on the orphanage board had given her access to records that others preferred forgotten, and her abrupt departure for Ceylon had coincided suspiciously with the cessation of all investigations. Inspector Craddock found the narrative satisfyingly complete. A respected doctor whose past misdeeds had been buried through the convenient silence of the primary witness, now facing exposure upon her return. The method suited his expertise perfectly, the opportunity had been clearly established, and the motive carried both professional and personal desperation. The village embraced this solution with visible relief. "Always seemed too proud, that Marcus," declared Mrs. Tibbet, while Colonel Weatherby pronounced with military certainty that doctors know a clean job when they see one. Even the usually circumspect Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell admitted to unpleasant suspicions about medical involvement, though his legal training made him phrase such thoughts carefully. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very neatness of this conclusion. Seated by the morning-room window with her knitting, she observed that genuine crimes rarely presented themselves with such convenient clarity. Dr. Pemberton's nervous behavior struck her as the reaction of a man with secrets, certainly, but not necessarily the specific secret that had led to murder. Her attention was drawn to details that seemed to contradict the obvious narrative. The theatrical precision with which Mrs. Ashworth had been arranged, the deliberate staging of the midnight drama, the opened window with its secure latch, all suggested calculation rather than panic. Most intriguingly, that whisper of scented ash on the window-sill spoke of cigarettes far more exotic than any village doctor would smoke. She had noticed Miss Diana Forrester's silver case appearing and disappearing with professional ease, and once caught the faintest scent of violets when the young woman stood near the French doors. Furthermore, the collective behavior of the other guests troubled her. Rather than relief at having suspicion focus elsewhere, several seemed increasingly agitated. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's distress appeared layered with surprise rather than defensive loyalty, while the Blackwood's earlier breakdown about innocent children and old sins suggested their involvement in the orphanage scandal ran deeper than mere knowledge. When Mrs. Pemberton provided her husband's alibi, stating they had been together throughout the evening except for those moments when everyone rushed to the library, her words carried the desperate precision of someone trying to convince herself as much as the inspector. Dr. Pemberton himself looked at his wife with strained gratitude that barely concealed his impatience, insisting somewhat too forcefully that Mrs. Ashworth had died through her own apparatus, by which I mean her staging. As Craddock prepared to escort the doctor to Ashford for formal questioning, Miss Marple reflected that, while Dr. Pemberton certainly possessed secrets worth protecting, the web of complicity seemed to extend far beyond one man's professional misconduct. The orphanage scandal, whatever its true nature, had apparently required the silence and cooperation of several prominent families, making Mrs. Ashworth's threatened revelations dangerous to more than just the obvious suspect. "Windows," she remarked mildly to no one in particular, "are so often made to seem guilty. I remember once a canary that escaped. So exciting, but the cat had just had quite enough of it." Miss Marple set aside her knitting, noting how often the right hand copies what the left writes, and how easy it becomes to be certain of the wrong person simply because everyone agrees one ought to be. When Inspector Craddock departed with his confident prisoner, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to Rosemere under the perfectly reasonable pretense of retrieving her forgotten reading spectacles. Mrs. Blythe, grateful for sympathetic company in the aftermath of such upheaval, welcomed her return and proved surprisingly forthcoming about the household's recent peculiarities. The library, now sealed with official tape, nevertheless yielded its secrets to careful observation through the glass-paneled door. Miss Marple's keen eyes focused immediately on the appointment book, still open to that ominous midnight entry. Something about the handwriting troubled her, not its content, which had seemed so dramatically appropriate, but its execution. In the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, subtle differences became apparent that had been obscured by candlelight and shock. "Mrs. Blythe," Miss Marple inquired gently, "I noticed Mrs. Ashworth was quite particular about her correspondence. Did she have preferred writing materials?" The housekeeper's face brightened at this safe domestic topic. "Oh, yes, miss. Madame was very specific about her fountain pen, a lovely silver piece she brought back from Ceylon. She always used violet ink, you see. Said it reminded her of the jacaranda trees. Wouldn't touch ordinary blue ink, called it shopkeeper's scrawl." This revelation struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. The appointment book entry was written in unmistakably blue ink, not violet, and closer examination revealed subtle variations in letter formation that suggested a different hand entirely. Someone familiar enough with Mrs. Ashworth's writing to approximate it under casual scrutiny, but not intimate enough to avoid small betrayals of pressure and angle. When Mrs. Blythe obligingly retrieved the reading spectacles from the morning room, Miss Marple noticed a sheet of blotting paper beneath the appointment book, its surface bearing the ghostly mirror image of correspondence. Held to the light, the reversed writing revealed tantalizing fragments. "Cannot allow the children's memory to be," and "Your silence has been purchased long enough." Most significantly, one line read clearly, "Diana knows everything now." The reference to Diana sent Miss Marple's thoughts immediately to Miss Diana Forrester, whose composed professionalism had seemed oddly out of place among the shocked guests. Mrs. Blythe confirmed that Mrs. Ashworth had been receiving regular correspondence from London, particularly from a firm whose name she remembered, because it had seemed so modern for a lady's business. Forrester investigations, private inquiries discreetly handled. A brief visit to the post office, ostensibly to purchase stamps, confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. Mrs. Tibbet, still flush with importance from the morning's revelations, eagerly discussed the increased postal activity at Rosemere. Miss Diana Forrester had indeed visited the previous week, her luggage bearing the same London address as Mrs. Ashworth's regular correspondence. The picture emerging was far more complex than Inspector Craddock's tidy solution suggested. Mrs. Ashworth had not returned to Little Wickham as a lone avenger nursing 30-year-old grievances. She had returned as a client of professional investigators, armed with evidence methodically gathered over months of careful inquiry. Miss Diana Forrester was not a casual London acquaintance, but a private detective, and the evening's promised revelations had been planned with the precision of a legal proceeding. Yet someone among the carefully selected guests had anticipated this strategy and moved to prevent it with deadly calculation. The killer had not merely murdered Mrs. Ashworth, but had attempted to transform a professional investigation into the appearance of personal obsession, complete with a forged appointment book entry that suggested unbalanced determination rather than methodical justice. Miss Marple reflected on the theatrical precision of the crime scene, the carefully arranged body, the strategically placed letter opener, the opened window with its secure latch. These details spoke not of panic or desperation, but of someone who understood the psychology of detection well enough to misdirect it. The scented cigarette ash on the windowsill, which she now recognized as matching Miss Forrester's distinctive violet-tinged tobacco, suggested the private investigator had been positioned to observe or participate in whatever confrontation had been planned. The question was no longer simply who had killed Mrs. Ashworth, but who among the guests possessed both the intimate knowledge necessary to forge her handwriting and the calculating intelligence to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. Someone who had been close enough to study her habits and correspondence, yet positioned to avoid immediate suspicion when the carefully constructed evidence pointed elsewhere. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles thoughtfully. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood innocence well enough to counterfeit it convincingly. She would need to have a very careful conversation, indeed with Miss Diana Forrester, assuming, of course, that the young woman was still alive to have it. The discovery of the ink discrepancy proved to be the thread that, when pulled carefully, began to unravel the entire fabric of deception surrounding Mrs. Ashworth's murder. Miss Marple, armed with Mrs. Blythe's revelation about the violet ink preference, found herself viewing the previous evening's events through an entirely different lens. The appointment book entry, so dramatically appropriate in its midnight timing, revealed itself as the work of someone familiar with Mrs. Ashworth's habits, but not intimate with her personal preferences. Mrs. Blythe's further revelations proved illuminating in ways that extended far beyond domestic details. Mrs. Ashworth had indeed been receiving regular correspondence from London, specifically from a firm whose modern name had caught the housekeeper's attention. Forrester Investigations, private inquiries discreetly handled. The connection to Miss Diana Forrester became unmistakable when Mrs. Blythe mentioned that the young woman had visited Rosemere the previous week, her luggage bearing the same London address as the regular correspondence. When Miss Marple arranged a quiet meeting with Miss Forrester at the Crown and Heart, the young woman's professional composure finally showed cracks under gentle but persistent questioning. The revelation that she was indeed a private investigator hired by Mrs. Ashworth transformed the entire complexion of the case. This had not been the return of a bitter exile, nursing old grievances, but a carefully orchestrated investigation conducted with professional thoroughness over months of meticulous inquiry. Miss Forrester's account of the evening's events proved particularly enlightening. Mrs. Ashworth had positioned her outside the library window as a precautionary measure, understanding that her promised revelations might provoke desperate action. The investigator had witnessed the crucial moments through the gap in the curtains, Mrs. Ashworth pouring the cognac, speaking a single syllable that might have been a name, then the glass falling and the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. Most significantly, she'd observed someone entering the library after Mrs. Ashworth's collapse, rearranging the scene with theatrical precision before the other guests arrived. The missing evidence proved as revealing as what remained. A brown leather folio marked Orphans, 1898-1902, had vanished from the library safe, along with Mrs. Ashworth's beloved silver fountain pen. The folio had contained copies of altered adoption certificates, embellished financial records, and checks drawn through Hartwell and Smythe client account that had been redirected to various private investments. The systematic nature of the documentation suggested not individual misconduct but coordinated fraud involving multiple prominent families. Dr. Pemberton's release from custody and his subsequent revelations added crucial context to the conspiracy's scope. His medical concerns 3 decades earlier had extended beyond simple medication irregularities to patterns of death among the orphanage's most vulnerable residents, children without family connections whose disappearance would generate minimal inquiry. The doctor's attempts to raise concerns had been met with a wall of influential resistance, suggesting the conspiracy possessed both reach and resources. Miss Marple's subsequent visits to the remaining suspects revealed a community in the grip of barely controlled panic. The Hartwells maintained their facade of shocked respectability, but Geoffrey Hartwell's legal precision seemed designed more to conceal than reveal, while his wife, Constance's perpetual smile had acquired a brittle quality that suggested profound strain. Most tellingly, Miss Marple observed in Hartwell's meticulously ordered study a silver-banded fountain pen and a bottle of distinctly blue ink, materials that could easily have been used to forge the appointment book entry. The Blackwoods had retreated into mutual recrimination and barely concealed terror. Mrs. Blackwood's earlier breakdown about innocent children and old sins took on new significance when viewed alongside her husband's former position on the orphanage's financial committee. Their deteriorating state suggested intimate involvement in whatever systematic abuse had required Mrs. Ashworth's silence and eventual elimination. Colonel Weatherby's military bearing remained intact, but his habitual punctuality had become compulsive, almost frantic. When pressed about Mrs. Ashworth's telephone call the previous evening, he admitted she had threatened to expose irregularities in charitable accounting, though he maintained these had been properly explained to the board at the time. Miss Marple noted the faint outline of a pawnbroker's ticket in his pocket, suggesting that Honor had indeed been forced to borrow, providing additional motive for preserving the conspiracy's silence. The pattern emerging was one of systematic corruption that had required the cooperation of multiple prominent citizens over several decades. The Hartwells, as legal representatives, had managed official documentation and deflected inquiries. The Blackwoods had observed conditions first-hand through their business connections while maintaining complicit silence. Colonel Weatherby had possessed the authority to influence or suppress investigations through his counsel position. Dr. Pemberton had been positioned as the obvious scapegoat, his legitimate medical concerns twisted into evidence of guilt. Mrs. Ashworth's return, armed with professional investigators and carefully documented evidence, had threatened to expose not merely individual misconduct, but a network of complicity extending through Little Wickham's most respected families. Her murder represented not panic, but calculated elimination of the primary threat to their collective security. Miss Marple reflected that the theatrical staging of the crime scene now seemed less like misdirection and more like a message, a demonstration of the conspiracy's reach and sophistication. The killer had possessed both intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's habits and the cold calculation necessary to transform a professional investigation into the appearance of personal obsession. Most significantly, they had understood the psychology of detection well enough to misdirect it toward the most obvious suspect while eliminating the evidence that could expose the truth. The question no longer concerned simply who had killed Mrs. Ashworth, but which member of this network possessed the legal knowledge necessary to forge documents convincingly, the access required to study her personal habits, and the calculating intelligence to orchestrate such elaborate deception. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not among the obvious suspects, but with someone who understood both guilt and innocence well enough to counterfeit either when circumstances required. As evening approached and the village settled into its deceptively peaceful routine, Miss Marple prepared for what she sensed would be the investigation's most crucial phase. Someone among Little Wickham's most respected citizens was a killer of extraordinary cunning, and they would need to be approached with all the careful strategy that such dangerous quarry demanded. The morning brought with it a development that transformed the entire complexion of the case. Mrs. Tibbet at the post office found herself distributing a series of cream-colored envelopes bearing Mrs. Ashworth's elegant return address, each one containing what could only be described as a carefully worded demand for financial compensation. The letters, couched in scrupulous politeness yet unmistakably threatening, referred to old obligations now due, and suggested that truth might be spared public airing in consideration of private restitution. The recipient's reactions proved as illuminating as the correspondence itself. Mr. Blackwood tore his envelope open on the post office steps, went visibly grey, and stuffed the contents hastily into his pocket, with an attempt at nonchalance that fooled nobody. Mrs. Constance Hartwell accepted hers with a bright murmur and placed it, unopened, in her handbag, as one might handle a troublesome insect. Colonel Weatherby read his with military efficiency, folding it precisely as though it were merely routine correspondence, though his habitual pocket-watch checking became even more compulsive. Inspector Craddock's examination of the postmark revealed the letter's impossible timing. Stamped at Ashford's sorting office at 6:30 that morning. Certainly not by a woman who had died the previous midnight. Someone intended the village to believe Mrs. Ashworth had been a blackmailer, transforming her from victim to villain with calculated precision. Miss Marple observed that the violet ink Mrs. Ashworth invariably used had been replaced with common blue, and the handwriting, while superficially convincing, lacked the subtle humor that had characterized the deceased woman's actual correspondence. The discovery of these letters coincided with a more direct assault on the investigation itself. Miss Diana Forrester, returning to Rosemere that evening to collect additional evidence from her concealed files, was discovered by Mrs. Blythe the following morning in the library, unconscious beside an overturned chair. Dr. Pemberton, summoned despite the morning's complications, diagnosed chloroform poisoning administered with professional precision, enough to incapacitate but not to kill, suggesting someone with medical knowledge who had calculated the dosage carefully. Miss Forrester's account, when she regained consciousness, revealed the attack's true purpose. Someone had entered the library while she worked, approaching from behind with a cloth soaked in chloroform. Before losing consciousness, she had glimpsed a figure in dark clothing and caught the scent of an expensive cologne she couldn't immediately identify. Most significantly, her leather folio containing copies of the orphanage documentation had vanished, along with Mrs. Ashworth's silver fountain pen, which she had been using to annotate the evidence. The pen's subsequent discovery by a village boy, discarded in the stream near the Hartwells' property, provided Miss Marple with crucial confirmation of her growing suspicions. Though wiped clean, it still bore the faint scent of violets, not from Mrs. Ashworth's ink, but from Miss Forrester's distinctive cigarettes. The location of its disposal, so close to the legal offices where Geoffrey Hartwell maintained his practice, seemed less coincidental than calculated. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, emboldened by her husband's release and perhaps by the realization that silence had protected no one, sought out Miss Marple with revealing information. "Vivienne always wrote everything down," she confided, her nervous energy replaced by steely determination. Even as a girl, she kept detailed records of everything she observed. Geoffrey used to joke that she would make a better solicitor than he would, the way she documented every conversation, every transaction. The Hartwells themselves had begun to show the strain of maintaining their facade. Geoffrey's legal precision had developed a defensive edge, while his wife Constance's perpetual smile had acquired a brittle quality that suggested profound anxiety. Miss Marple noted that Geoffrey's usually immaculate cuffs bore faint blue ink stains, and his study contained both the silver-banded fountain pen and blue ink that could have produced the forged correspondence. The Blackwoods had descended into open recrimination, their whispered arguments now conducted in public with increasing desperation. Mrs. Blackwood's references to innocent children and blood money painted a clearer picture of systematic exploitation that extended far beyond simple financial irregularities. Colonel Weatherby's military bearing remained intact, but his precise timing had become obsessive, and Miss Marple observed that a pawnbroker's ticket previously glimpsed in his pocket had mysteriously disappeared. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected that the day's events had revealed the conspiracy's growing desperation. The blackmail letters represented an attempt to recast Mrs. Ashworth as a villain deserving of elimination, while the attack on Miss Forrester demonstrated the killer's willingness to escalate violence to protect their secrets. Most significantly, the careful staging of both the letters and the assault suggested someone with intimate knowledge of legal procedures, medical techniques, and the psychology of misdirection. The fountain pen's disposal near the Hartwell property seemed less like careless evidence disposal and more like a deliberate message, a demonstration of the killer's confidence in their ability to manipulate both evidence and perception. Someone among Little Wycombe's most respected citizens possessed not only the motive to preserve the orphanage conspiracy, but the professional expertise to orchestrate such sophisticated deception while maintaining an appearance of shocked respectability. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had observed the crucial moment when careful planning began to reveal its own weaknesses. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals often possessed the intelligence to construct elaborate deceptions, but rarely the wisdom to know when to stop adding unnecessary complications to their carefully crafted lies. Miss Marple's approach to what she privately termed her final test required the delicate precision of a surgeon combined with the patience of a naturalist observing dangerous prey. She arranged to meet Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell under the perfectly reasonable pretense of seeking legal advice about Mrs. Ashworth's estate, specifically regarding some irregularities in documentation that required professional clarification. The meeting took place in her own sitting room, where afternoon light streamed through lace curtains, and the familiar domestic setting might encourage the sort of unguarded moment she required. Hartwell arrived precisely on time, his legal training evident in his punctual courtesy, though Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands as he set down his briefcase and the way his eyes moved constantly to assess potential exits. "So kind of you to spare the time, Mr. Hartwell," Miss Marple began, settling into her chair with her knitting. "Such a comfort to have proper legal guidance in these trying circumstances. I find myself quite bewildered by certain inconsistencies in poor Vivian's papers." She produced a folder containing what appeared to be Mrs. Ashworth's correspondence, though careful observers might have noted the papers were positioned to conceal their actual contents. The handwriting analysis has been particularly fascinating. Inspector Craddock mentioned how modern techniques can detect the most subtle forgeries, pressure variations, ink composition, even the angle of pen strokes. Quite remarkable what experts can determine from a single sentence. Hartwell's professional composure remained intact, but Miss Marple caught the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. "Handwriting analysis can be useful," he agreed carefully, "though courts require substantial corroboration before accepting such evidence. Indeed, though I understand Mrs. Ashworth was quite particular about her writing materials. Always that distinctive violet ink, never ordinary blue." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she continued. "Mrs. Blythe mentioned how Vivian would never use anything else. Said it reminded her of the jacaranda trees in Ceylon. Such a romantic notion." She reached into her work basket and withdrew Mrs. Ashworth's silver fountain pen, now returned from police custody. This was her treasured possession. "I thought perhaps you might examine it professionally. There seemed to be some unusual markings near the nib that could indicate tampering." Hartwell's reaction was swift and telling. His hand moved instinctively toward the pen before stopping abruptly, and Miss Marple observed how his fingers curved in the exact grip pattern of someone intimately familiar with the instrument's weight and balance. The recognition was unmistakable, though he covered it with professional interest. "Fountain pens can be temperamental," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Ink flow irregularities often create misleading impressions." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How true, though Miss Forrester, such a thorough young woman, mentioned something curious about the appointment book entry. The formation of certain letters suggested someone who knew Mrs. Ashworth's handwriting well enough to approximate it, yet lacked the unconscious habits that make writing truly individual. Rather like an actor playing a familiar role, but missing the subtle gestures that make a performance authentic." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. Hartwell's composure began showing hairline cracks, a slight dampness at his temples despite the cool afternoon. The way his breathing had become carefully controlled rather than natural. Legal documents require precise attention to such details, Miss Marple continued conversationally. I imagine someone with extensive experience in document preparation might develop quite sophisticated skills in, shall we say, textual analysis, the sort of expertise that could prove invaluable in various circumstances. Hartwell's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the courteous exterior. Miss Marple, I'm not entirely certain what you're suggesting, but— Oh, I'm not suggesting anything at all, she replied with gentle firmness. Merely observing how knowledge can be such a burden. Mrs. Ashworth carried the weight of truth for 30 years, while others carried the weight of concealment. Both can prove equally destructive to one's peace of mind. She set aside her knitting and looked at him directly, her mild blue eyes holding unexpected steel. The question, Mr. Hartwell, is whether conscience eventually demands confession or whether self-preservation requires increasingly desperate measures to maintain carefully constructed lies. Hartwell rose abruptly, his legal training warring with something approaching panic. I believe this conversation has moved beyond estate matters, Miss Marple. Perhaps we should continue when you have more specific legal questions. But Miss Marple had seen what she needed. The moment when calculated control gave way to genuine fear, when professional competence revealed its foundation in guilty knowledge. As Hartwell gathered his papers with hands that no longer quite steady, she reflected that the most dangerous criminals often possess the intelligence to construct elaborate deceptions, but rarely the wisdom to recognize when their carefully crafted performances had been seen through by an audience of one quiet, observant woman with her knitting. The drawing room at Rosemere had been stripped of its theatrical candlelight, appearing almost austere in the pale afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Inspector Craddock had assembled all the principal parties at Miss Marple's quiet insistence, though his expression suggested considerable skepticism about the elderly woman's unconventional methods. Dr. and Mrs. Pemberton sat together with newfound solidarity born of shared ordeal, while the Blackwoods huddled in obvious distress. Colonel Weatherby maintained his military bearing despite the circumstances, and Miss Diana Forrester observed the proceedings with professional detachment. Geoffrey and Constance Hartwell occupied chairs near the fireplace, he with careful legal composure, she with a brittle smile that no longer quite concealed her mounting anxiety. Miss Marple settled into her familiar wingback chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she began, with characteristic mildness. The difficulty with this case has been that everyone assumed Mrs. Ashworth returned to Little Wickham as an individual seeking personal revenge. In reality, she came as the client of professional investigators, armed with evidence gathered through months of methodical inquiry. This distinction transforms what appeared to be emotional blackmail into something far more dangerous, the systematic exposure of documented criminal conspiracy. She paused to adjust her spectacles, her mild gaze taking in each face with gentle precision. The orphanage scandal of 30 years ago required the cooperation of multiple professionals: medical authority to explain suspicious deaths, legal expertise to manage fraudulent documentation, social position to deflect investigations, and financial access to redirect charitable funds. This was not individual misconduct, but coordinated exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our community. Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably, while Mrs. Blackwood's quiet sobbing provided a counterpoint to Miss Marple's measured words. Mrs. Ashworth's evidence threatened not merely individual reputations, but the entire network of complicity that had protected this conspiracy for 3 decades. Her murder was not the act of a desperate individual, but the calculated elimination of the primary threat to collective security. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she continued. The killer possessed intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's habits, professional expertise in document forgery, and the cold intelligence necessary to transform a professional investigation into the appearance of personal obsession. Consider the appointment book entry, "The truth will out, midnight," written in blue ink rather than Mrs. Ashworth's invariable violet by someone familiar enough with her handwriting to approximate it under casual scrutiny, yet not intimate, enough to avoid subtle betrayals of pressure and angle. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional composure remained intact, though Miss Marple observed the faint dampness at his temples and the way his breathing had become carefully controlled. Mrs. Blythe confirmed that Mrs. Ashworth never used ordinary blue ink, calling it shopkeeper's scrawl. She was quite particular about her violet ink, said it reminded her of the jacaranda trees in Ceylon. The forged entry also revealed other telling details. The dots above the eyes placed with mechanical precision, rather than Mrs. Ashworth's characteristic habit of setting them like little stars, just off to the right. She reached into her work basket and produced a sheet of blotting paper. The library's blotting paper bore the ghostly mirror image of Mrs. Ashworth's actual final correspondence, including the revealing line, "Diana knows everything now." This was not the sentence of a blackmailer, but of a woman who expected professional corroboration for her evidence. Miss Forrester spoke for the first time, her voice steady and professional. "Mrs. Ashworth positioned me outside the library window as a precautionary witness. I observed someone entering after her collapse, rearranging the scene with theatrical precision, the body positioned dramatically. The window opened to suggest outside intrusion. The appointment book opened to that forged entry. The person wore dark clothing and moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the house's layout." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. The subsequent events revealed the killer's growing desperation. The blackmail letters, posted impossibly after Mrs. Ashworth's death, represented an attempt to recast her from victim to villain. The attack on Miss Forrester, administered with precisely calculated chloroform dosage, demonstrated both medical knowledge and the willingness to escalate violence when initial misdirection proved insufficient. She set aside her knitting and looked directly at Geoffrey Hartwell. The killer required legal expertise to forge documents convincingly, intimate familiarity with Mrs. Ashworth's correspondence through professional representation, and the authority to orchestrate such sophisticated deception while maintaining an appearance of shocked respectability. Most tellingly, they possessed Mrs. Ashworth's treasured silver fountain pen long enough to study its weight and balance, yet carelessly disposed of it near their own property when it became incriminating evidence. Hartwell's mask of professional courtesy finally began to crack. "Miss Marple, these are serious accusations requiring substantial proof." "The proof, Mr. Hartwell, lies in the accumulation of details that individually might seem insignificant, but collectively form an unbreakable chain. The blue ink stains on your cuffs the morning after the murder, your possession of the silver-banded fountain pen and blue ink that produced the forged correspondence, your intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's habits through your legal representation of the orphanage board, your access to Rosemere's library, and your familiarity with the house's layout from numerous professional visits." Inspector Craddock stepped forward with quiet authority. "Geoffrey Hartwell, I am arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Vivian Ashworth and the attempted murder of Miss Diana Forrester." As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Hartwell's carefully maintained facade finally collapsed entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath 30 years of respectable deception. "She would have destroyed everything," he said with bitter precision. "Families, reputations, the entire structure of this community. Some secrets are worth preserving at any cost." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting, reflecting that in her long experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who convinced themselves that their crime served some higher purpose than mere self-preservation. Geoffrey Hartwell had murdered not from panic or desperation, but from the calculated conviction that his network of complicity deserved protection more than Mrs. Ashworth deserved justice. The drawing room fell silent, except for Constance Hartwell's quiet weeping and the measured ticking of the mantel clock. Truth, as Mrs. Ashworth had promised, had indeed come out at last, though at a cost that would forever change the seemingly peaceful village of Little Wickham. The weeks following Geoffrey Hartwell's arrest brought revelations that transformed Little Wickham's understanding of its own history with devastating completeness. Miss Diana Forrester's investigation, now freed from violent interference, revealed the orphanage conspiracy's true scope through meticulously documented evidence spanning nearly a decade of systematic exploitation. The financial records painted a picture of breathtaking callousness. Charitable donations intended for children's care had been systematically diverted through fraudulent invoices and inflated contracts, with Hartwell's legal expertise ensuring every transaction appeared legitimate under casual scrutiny. The Blackwoods Construction Company had submitted bills for repairs never completed, while Colonel Weatherby's Oversight Committee position provided the authority to approve expenditures without meaningful review. More horrifying still were adoption records revealing that healthy children from connected families were placed quickly with loving homes, while those without advocates simply disappeared from official documentation. Mrs. Ashworth's return from Ceylon had been motivated not by personal vendetta, but by maternal grief. Her infant nephew, orphaned by fever and placed in the institution's care, had vanished from all records within months of her departure. 30 years of guilt over abandoning him had driven her methodical investigation, conducted through professional channels with documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny. Hartwell's confession, delivered with characteristic legal precision, revealed the murder's calculated planning. Recognizing Mrs. Ashworth's true purpose behind her request for genealogical research, he had spent weeks studying her habits while maintaining helpful cooperation. The prussic acid had been positioned in her private cognac supply during an early visit, with the midnight timing calculated for maximum theatrical impact, while ensuring multiple witnesses for alibis. The other conspirators faced their reckonings with varying dignity. Constance Hartwell collapsed utterly, her brittle smile finally shattered, replaced by grief and shame that aged her 20 years in an afternoon. The Blackwoods, relieved of crushing suspicion, found fragile peace in mutual confession. Mrs. Blackwood spoke openly of systematic neglect and financial mismanagement, of vulnerable children treated as commodities, their existence erased through falsified records. Colonel Weatherby, stripped of military bearing and carefully maintained facade, confessed to suppressing inquiries under pressure from important men, describing how small compromises had escalated into outright cover-ups. His pawnbroker's ticket, it emerged, had been for a Medal of Honor, exchanged for funds to settle debts threatening exposure years earlier. Dr. and Mrs. Pemberton found themselves in curious positions. The doctor, vindicated of murder yet burdened by past failings, his reluctance to speak more forcefully against the orphanage's conditions, struggled with compromised conscience. Eleanor revealed long-held suspicions and quiet agony of living with her husband's moral burden. Yet their shared ordeal forged a new, more honest bond built on truth rather than convenient silences. The village itself struggled to absorb revelations that transformed local history's understanding. Families who had donated generously discovered their charity had funded private luxuries rather than children's care. The memorial garden dedicated to children called home too soon took on sinister implications when viewed through systematic neglect rather than natural tragedy. Miss Forrester departed as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind meticulously organized evidence ensuring Hartwell's conviction and full scandal exposure. The Midnight Tea House, forever associated with Violent Truth's emergence, was eventually sold to a family from outside the county, eager for fresh starts. Miss Marple, observing the slow, painful healing process, reflected on human folly's enduring nature and truth's redemptive power. She recognized how communities, like individuals, could become complacent, allowing small compromises to fester into grave injustices. The most dangerous secrets were often those protected by collective silence, where exposure fears outweighed moral imperatives to speak out. As autumn deepened into winter and first frosts dusted the village, green, Miss Marple found herself knitting by the fire, new patterns emerging from practiced hands. The stitches, intricate and interlocking, mirrored complex webs of human relationships, hidden motives, and revealed truths. She reflected on Mrs. Ashworth, who had returned to confront her past, paying the ultimate price for courage, and Geoffrey Hartwell, whose carefully constructed life crumbled because he believed some secrets worth preserving at any cost. In drawing rooms where whispers had once carried gossip, conversations now turned to sober reflections on dark undercurrents flowing beneath seemingly peaceful existence. Truth, like rain, had found every gap in old paint, and though the village would heal, it would carry forever the knowledge that respectability could mask the most terrible crimes when those in authority chose silence over justice. The world, Miss Marple mused, was full of such patterns, and her work was simply to observe them, recognizing subtle threads connecting seemingly disparate events, understanding that even in the coziest villages, the deadliest mysteries often lay hidden in plain sight. Snow came early to Little Wickham that winter, blanketing the village in pristine white that seemed to offer absolution for the darkness recently exposed. The trial of Geoffrey Hartwell had concluded with swift justice, his conviction carrying a sentence that would ensure he never again wielded the legal authority he had so catastrophically abused. The evidence presented by Miss Diana Forrester, combined with Miss Marple's quiet but devastating observations, left no room for reasonable doubt about either his guilt or the systematic nature of his crimes. The other conspirators faced consequences that reflected both justice and mercy. The Blackwoods, having cooperated fully with authorities and demonstrated genuine remorse, received substantial fines and social ostracism but avoided imprisonment. Their construction business failed as clients withdrew support, yet they remained in Little Wickham, living more humbly, while Mrs. Blackwood emerged as an unexpected advocate for vulnerable children. Colonel Weatherby lost his military pension and council position, departing the village in quiet disgrace, unable to face the community he had once claimed to serve with honor. Dr. and Mrs. Pemberton found themselves in the curious position of vindication shadowed by moral complexity. Though cleared of murder, the doctor faced professional censure for his past failures to challenge the orphanage's practices more forcefully. Yet their shared ordeal forged a deeper, more honest marriage, and they began working quietly to support local charities, a form of penance that spoke louder than any public confession. Constance Hartwell never recovered from the revelation of her husband's true nature. Her brittle social smile, maintained through decades of willful blindness, cracked beyond repair, leaving her withdrawn and dependent on relatives who struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the reality of her complicity through silence. The most remarkable development came through Miss Forrester's continued investigation, which had uncovered a trail leading across the Atlantic. Mrs. Ashworth's nephew Arthur, the infant whose disappearance had driven her 30-year quest for truth, had not perished as the falsified records indicated. Instead, he had been quietly placed with a railway clerk and his wife, who had emigrated to Nova Scotia in 1902. Now a respected ship's carpenter with a family of his own, he had recently written to London charities seeking information about relations left behind. Miss Forrester's letter, delivered on thick cream paper with characteristic professional precision, brought news that transformed grief into something approaching peace. Miss Marple received this intelligence while sitting by her fire, knitting needles clicking softly as she absorbed the profound justice of it. Mrs. Ashworth's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her courage had not only exposed systematic corruption, but had ultimately reunited a family separated by criminal conspiracy. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple. The truth, pursued at such terrible cost, had yielded this unexpected gift of living hope. Rosemere itself stood empty through the winter months, too tainted by tragedy for comfortable habitation. Eventually, a young couple from outside the county, unaware of its dark history, purchased the mansion with plans to convert it into a modern art gallery. Their innocent enthusiasm gradually began to erase the lingering shadows, though older villagers still spoke of the place where Vivian Ashworth died, in hushed, respectful tones. The village transformed in subtler ways as well. Gossip, while still prevalent, carried new undertones of caution and responsibility. The memorial garden dedicated to the forgotten children received careful tending, with snowdrops appearing early among the stones, like small white bells nodding in acknowledgement of finally recognized suffering. At the Crown and Heart, conversations had altered in key and volume. Men spoke lower. Women asked questions with the gentleness of people who understood that curiosity could cut as sharply as kindness could heal. Mrs. Tibbet continued commanding her post office counter, but she had begun setting aside penny sweets for children whose coats were thin, and no one found it necessary to remark upon this quiet charity. Miss Marple, observing the slow, painful healing process, reflected on patterns both human and divine. The most dangerous criminals were often those who wrapped their crimes in respectability, using positions of trust to exploit the vulnerable while maintaining facades of propriety. Yet truth possessed its own relentless power, surfacing when least expected to destroy carefully constructed lies with devastating completeness. As spring approached and the snow began its retreat, Mrs. Marple continued her knitting by the fire, new patterns emerging from practiced hands, each stitch built upon the last, mistakes becoming visible only in retrospect, corrections requiring patience and careful attention to detail. Human nature, she mused, would provide endless work for thoughtful minds and foolish hearts alike. That, too, was a kind of sufficiency, the knowledge that in a world where evil could flourish in respectable settings, there would always be need for those willing to observe carefully, think clearly, and speak truth when silence became complicity. The midnight tea-house had indeed served its purpose, though not as Mrs. Ashworth had intended. Truth had come out at last, bringing justice for the forgotten and hope for the living, proving once again that even the deadliest secrets could not long survive the patient scrutiny of those who refused to look away. Spring returned to Little Wickham with the tentative grace of a community learning to trust again. The daffodils emerged along the lanes with unusual determination, their bright faces seeming to nod approval at the village's slow but steady progress toward healing. Miss Marple, observing this seasonal transformation from her cottage window while her knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, reflected on the curious ways that truth, however painful in its emergence, ultimately proved more nourishing to the human spirit than the most comfortable lies. The final threads. Inspector Craddock's final visit brought resolution to the remaining mysteries that had troubled his methodical mind. The blackmail letters, posted impossibly after Mrs. Ashworth's death, had indeed been Constance Hartwell's final act of misguided loyalty. Mrs. Tibbet, her discretion finally overcome by the weight of truth, revealed seeing Constance departing on her husband's motor bicycle at dawn, powder on her gloves to hide the telltale ink stains. The ride to Ashford's sorting office and back had been completed with the mechanical precision of someone following instructions without allowing herself to consider their implications. "She has confessed everything to Reverend Matthews," Miss Marple informed the inspector gently. "I believe she finds some peace in finally speaking truthfully, though she will carry the burden of her choices for whatever years remain to her." The violet-scented cigarette ash on the library windowsill, which had initially suggested exotic intrigue, proved to belong to Miss Forrester's professional vigil. The private investigator had positioned herself as Mrs. Ashworth's witness, smoking to steady her nerves while observing through the gap in the curtains. Her testimony had provided the crucial evidence that transformed what might have been dismissed as a domestic tragedy into the exposure of systematic criminal conspiracy. Lives transformed. The Blackwoods had surprised everyone, including themselves, by remaining in Little Wickham despite their social disgrace. Their construction business had failed, but Mrs. Blackwood discovered an unexpected calling in caring for vulnerable children. Her nervous energy, once channeled into whispered gossip and social climbing, now served the local school and orphanages with quiet dedication. Her husband, stripped of his former bluster, found dignity in honest labor that required no deception or moral compromise. Dr. and Mrs. Pemberton had weathered the storm of revelation with their marriage intact, though forever changed. The doctor's practice had diminished as some patients sought care elsewhere, but those who remained did so with full knowledge of his past struggles and present commitment to ethical medicine. Eleanor had emerged from her shell of nervous anxiety to become an advocate for children's welfare, her personal experience with moral complexity lending authenticity to her efforts. Colonel Weatherby had departed the village quietly, his military bearing finally broken by the weight of his compromised honor. The pawnbroker's ticket for his medal, exchanged years earlier to settle debts that threatened exposure, had been recovered by relatives who understood that some sacrifices cut too deeply for public acknowledgement. A memorial and a discovery. The most remarkable development came through Miss Forrester's continued investigation, which had uncovered a trail leading across the Atlantic Ocean. Arthur Ashworth, the infant whose disappearance had driven Mrs. Ashworth's 30-year quest for justice, had not perished as the falsified records indicated. Instead, he had been quietly placed with a railway clerk and his wife, who had emigrated to Nova Scotia in 1902 seeking better opportunities for their expanding family. When Arthur, now Arthur Pemberton, having taken his adoptive parents' name, received Miss Forrester's carefully worded letter, his response came swiftly. He was now a respected ship's carpenter with a family of his own, living a life of honest work and simple contentment. Though practical considerations prevented his journey to England, he wished to plant a tree in memory of the aunt who had never forgotten him. The ceremony took place on a bright morning when spring seemed to promise that renewal was indeed possible. A small gathering assembled near the memorial garden where a young rowan tree was planted with quiet dignity. Mrs. Blackwood brought the spade, her hands steady with purpose rather than trembling with anxiety. Dr. and Mrs. Pemberton attended without fanfare, their presence speaking of respect rather than obligation. No speeches were made. The tree went into the earth as simply as a promise kept. Rosemere reborn. The mansion itself had undergone the most visible transformation. The new owners, a young couple from Bath with artistic sensibilities and blessed ignorance of the property's dark history, had converted Rosemere into a bright gallery specializing in contemporary art. The room where Mrs. Ashworth had died now displayed landscapes of Ceylon, their tropical beauty serving as an unexpected memorial to her years of exile and eventual homecoming. Miss Marple attended the gallery's opening reception, noting how afternoon sunlight streamed through skylights cut into the old roof, banishing the shadows that had once concealed so many secrets. The library shelves, stripped of their heavier burdens, now held exhibition catalogues and guest books filled with appreciative comments from visitors who found the atmosphere remarkably peaceful. Systemic changes. The broader implications of the orphanage scandal had rippled through county society like stones thrown into still water. Miss Forrester's investigation had revealed similar patterns in neighboring districts, leading to comprehensive reforms in charitable oversight and adoption procedures. Her professional reputation, enhanced by the thoroughness of her work in Little Wickham, ensured that other long-buried secrets would face scrutiny from authorities finally willing to look beyond respectable facades. The memorial garden, dedicated to the forgotten children, received careful tending from volunteers who understood that remembrance was the first step toward ensuring such tragedies never repeated themselves. Snowdrops appeared early among the stones, like small white bells nodding acknowledgement of finally recognized suffering. Miss Marple's reflections. As summer deepened and the village settled into its eternal rhythms of market days and harvest preparations, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious nature of justice. Mrs. Ashworth's murder had been solved, her nephew found alive and well, the conspiracy exposed and reforms implemented. Yet the deeper questions remained unchanged, as they always did in her experience. How did communities allow systematic abuse to flourish under their very noses? What transformed ordinary people into willing participants in others' suffering? Why did the appearance of respectability so often mask the reality of corruption? The answers, she suspected, lay not in grand theories, but in the accumulation of small choices. Moments when individuals chose convenience over conscience, silence over truth, personal comfort over moral courage. Mrs. Ashworth had faced such a moment 30 years ago and chosen exile. Her return had represented a second chance to choose differently, and though it had cost her life, it had ultimately served justice more completely than any court verdict could have achieved. The continuing pattern. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and returned to her knitting, needles clicking in the familiar rhythm that had accompanied so many of her deepest thoughts. The pattern emerging under her fingers was complex yet orderly, each stitch building upon the last to create something both beautiful and functional. Human nature, she mused, possessed similar potential, capable of great darkness yet redeemable through courage, honesty, and the patient work of those who refused to accept that evil must triumph simply because it wore respectable clothing. The world would always need such people, she reflected with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Ashworth had been one of them, paying the ultimate price for her refusal to let sleeping injustices lie undisturbed. Miss Diana Forrester continued that work in her professional capacity, ensuring that truth possessed advocates even when its champions faced mortal danger. As evening approached and the familiar sounds of village life drifted through her open window, Miss Marple smiled gently. The midnight tea house had indeed served its purpose, though not as its hostess had originally intended. Truth had come out at last, bringing justice for the forgotten, hope for the living, and the hard-won knowledge that even the deadliest secrets could not long survive the patient scrutiny of those who refused to look away. The mystery of Mrs. Vivian Ashworth was solved, but life would continue to present new puzzles, new secrets, and new opportunities for observation. Miss Marple, ever composed and ever discerning, would be ready. After all, in a world where human nature remained beautifully, terribly consistent, there would always be work for those willing to watch, listen, and understand the patterns that connected seemingly innocent actions to their inevitable consequences. The knitting needles clicked softly in the gathering dusk, weaving together threads of memory, justice, and hope into something that might, with patience and care, prove strong enough to last.